there are things that are like specific about anti-Semitism that I just find really distasteful, and I find it the most distasteful from the left because of the hypocrisy, where they're stepping on eggshells these days around everything. Which fine, respect personal pronouns and all that. And it's like, well, if you're going to go down that path of stepping on eggshells around every other minority, it's like, if that's your shtick, step on eggshells around the Jews. So it's almost like the left-wing antagonism towards the Jews has made me think there is something weird about anti-Semitism that's specific. Because why are they just so bending over backwards? Sorry, this is what I experienced when writing my book, and I didn't go into it thinking I'd experience this, where there's just this hypocritical bending over backwards to antagonize the Jews.
Okay, I want to go to Dr. Laitman.
Look, I'm researching this phenomenon for a long time and looking at it over the span of history of thousands of years. The history of Jews, the origins of Jews, begins more or less 3,500 years ago in ancient Babylon. And so it's not about left or right or this group or that group and this society or that culture or people in our time. That's just things that are happening today. What we're looking at here is a phenomenon of a hatred towards a people that, as a researcher, I'm looking at it very differently. This is not a phenomenon that just erupted all of a sudden. It originates in ancient Babylon, which was the cradle of human civilization. When most of humanity was centralized there, it went through a big crisis, a social crisis. That Babylonian crisis, which is symbolized sometimes as the Tower of Babel. What happened was that people felt an eruption of human egoism, and that made people more alienated towards each other. And so those mostly 70 groups, 70 nations that existed there, they all came from there, but there was another group that was collected there, which was assembled by Abraham. He was an ideologue, he was a spiritual leader, he was a Babylonian leader. And he told people of all groups, of all tribes, clans, and nations, he told them, let's come together and try to rise above the human ego and live in social harmony. And he put together a group. That group was later called the people of Israel. The name Israel also comes from a combination of two words, Yashar El, which means directly towards that force of connection. Or it's also according to that maxim that we all know, love thy neighbor as thyself. That was actually the group that surrounded Abraham. And that was a group of people who started behaving according to a different motto, a different principle of positive connection, even to the point of love of man, above the growing differences and eruption of egoism. And that group existed that way for about 1,500 years until there was a shattering, which is what we know as the ruin of the temple. But what it actually means is that they started fighting, the ego has erupted among them as well. They started dispersing and moving apart from each other. Rifts began to happen between them to the point that their hatred increased to the point that the leader at that time, called Rabbi Akiva, he was trying to tell everyone, let's go back to this principle of love thy friend as thyself, rising above the hatred, above the ego, but no one listened anymore. And then that group was eventually ultimately scattered in all directions of the planet. And since then, we're in what's called exile. We don't actually have we didn't have our own country, and we don't have our own nationhood, because that nation of Israel emerged from the collection of all those nations that existed in Babylon. Their unity, their nationhood was not based on the biological connection like every other nation had, which was like a mother and father that eventually procreated and created descendants, etc. The people of Israel don't have that kind of blood connection. It's an ideological connection. And if the ideology stops putting people together, then they scatter because they no longer feel that something ties them to each other. However, if there's hatred from outside towards them, then it keeps them together, like a flock of sheep, if you will, like a herd. And otherwise, they'll scatter in all directions. And you see one in Australia, one in Israel, one in New York, and so on. And that's why we have no problem to find ourselves integrating with all the different societies and nations. However, today we're in a special time because the historical process reaches a point where all of humanity grows in its human ego, and that is blowing up all of the human connections that we have socially, nationally, between countries, between in terms of trade and commerce. You can see this in the European Union, for example. The human ego grows to the point where people can no longer cooperate properly and can't stand each other on a personal level. Hatred increases, animosity increases. And in that state, nations of the world are looking towards that group, the people of Israel. They have an inherent sentiment that there is something unique and weird and strange about this group of people. They, the other nations, can understand each other because they emerge from a similar root, from the same origins. The people of Israel, however, are a group that comes from all those nations and only holds itself together by their higher level of human connection that they once had. Today we're at a point where the nations of the world feel a certain growing hatred towards us. And they're right for feeling it, because it comes from the fact that we can demonstrate a method of human existence on a higher level. And they sense that this is not happening. It is a subconscious thing that they sense that we are somehow creating troubles and problems, or at least not making them go away. They don't exactly know what we're supposed to give to them, and we don't know either, but they sense that something is held by the Jews in that human network, and we don't understand what it is. We too don't understand why they hate us. We don't. But the deeper reason for it is because we're not creating that higher level of unity, that method of human connection that the world needs increasingly. And that's why we're seeing this happening again, and we're once again seeing indications like we saw in the Holocaust, but this time it will be a different thing, and it's no longer contained in a specific country. It's something that grows across the globe. And it will grow worse unless we will begin to demonstrate what the world expects with it, which is this method of higher human connection between us. When the Jews begin to do that, the world will sense that something's happening, that something is happening in the human network, and this antagonism towards us will subside. Let's try and see. This is something Kabbalists have been talking about for over 3,000 years.